The embers barely glowed against the midnight darkness of the Colorado wilderness. What the forest ranger found beside that dying campfire should have been impossible. A young woman, barely breathing, her lips blue from the cold, sitting perfectly, still as if she were waiting for something, or someone. But it wasn't the hypothermia that made Ranger Jake Morrison stop dead in his tracks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was the complete and utter silence that surrounded her, as if the very forest held its breath. And when he tried to speak to her, when he tried to get her to respond, he discovered something that would haunt him for weeks to come. She had no voice, not a whisper, not a sound. But 3 days later, when Scout leader Rebecca Chen was leading her troop through that same stretch of wilderness, she heard something that changed everything. A melody so pure, so haunting that it seemed to come from the very soul of the mountains themselves. And the impossible truth was about to unfold. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees below freezing when Jake Morrison made his final patrol of the night. 23 years of ranging through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains had taught him to trust his instincts, and tonight something felt wrong. The usual symphony of nocturnal creatures, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustling of small animals through the underbrush, even the whisper of wind through the pine needles, had fallen silent. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he followed the narrow trail that wound between towering spruce trees. The snow crunched beneath his boots with each step, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. He'd been walking for nearly an hour when he saw it, a faint orange glow flickering through the trees about 50 yards off the main path. Unauthorized. Camping was common enough, usually teenagers looking for adventure or hikers who'd lost track of time. But as Jake approached the source of the light, his steps slowed. The campfire was little more than dying coals, barely producing enough heat to warm someone's hands, let alone provide protection against the brutal mountain cold. And sitting beside it, cross-legged on the frozen ground, was a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 25, with long auburn hair that fell in waves around her shoulders. Her clothes were entirely wrong for the weather, a thin cotton dress that might have been white once, but was now stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. No coat, no blanket, no camping gear of any kind. Her feet were bare. "Miss?" Jake called out, his voice echoing strangely in the still air. "Miss, are you all right?" She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge his presence. Her eyes, a striking shade of green that seemed to catch and hold the dying firelight, remained fixed on the smoldering embers. Her skin had taken on an alarming blue-white pallor, and Jake could see that she was shivering, though she seemed to be fighting against it, trying to remain perfectly still. He approached slowly, the way he might approach an injured animal. "I'm Jake Morrison, Forest Ranger. You're in serious danger out here. The temperature's dropping fast, and you're showing signs of hypothermia." Still nothing, not even a flicker of recognition. Jake knelt beside her, noting that her breathing was shallow and rapid. When he reached out to touch her shoulder, her skin felt like ice through the thin fabric of her dress. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked gently. "Can you tell me how you got here?" The woman's lips moved slightly, as if she were trying to speak, but no sound emerged. Jake leaned closer, thinking perhaps she was whispering, but there was nothing, not even the faintest breath of air passing through her vocal cords. Over the next several minutes, Jake tried everything he could think of to get a response. He asked simple questions, requested that she nod or shake her head, even asked her to squeeze his hand. The woman seemed aware of his presence. Her eyes would occasionally shift to meet his, but she appeared completely unable to communicate. More concerning was her apparent inability or unwillingness to move from her position beside the dying fire. Jake had encountered his share of trauma victims over the years. People who'd been lost in the wilderness for days, survivors of hiking accidents, even victims of crimes who'd fled into the forest. But he'd never seen anything quite like this. The woman's silence felt different somehow, deeper than simple shock or fear. It was as if sound itself had been stolen from her. The practical side of his training kicked in. Hypothermia was a killer, and every minute that passed increased the danger. Jake radioed for emergency medical assistance, though he knew it would be at least 40 minutes before the paramedics could reach this location. In the meantime, he had to get her warm. He wrapped his own heavy coat around her shoulders, noting that she didn't resist, but also didn't seem to register the warmth. From his pack, he pulled out an emergency blanket and a thermos of hot coffee. The coffee she wouldn't take, but she allowed him to wrap the blanket around her legs. "I'm going to build up this fire," Jake explained, though he wasn't sure she was listening. "Get you warmed up before help arrives." As he worked to gather more wood and coax the dying embers back to life, Jake found himself stealing glances at the mysterious woman. There was something almost ethereal about her stillness, the way she seemed to exist in perfect harmony with the silence around her. Even her shivering had a rhythm to it, like a slow, steady heartbeat. The fire began to catch, flames dancing higher and casting flickering shadows across her face. For a moment, Jake thought he saw her lips curve into the faintest suggestion of a smile. But when he looked again, her expression was as blank as before. "The paramedics will be here soon," he said, settling down beside her to wait. "They'll take good care of you, get you to a hospital where they can figure out what's wrong." The woman turned to look at him then, really look at him, and Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. Her eyes held a depth of sadness that seemed almost infinite. But there was something else there too. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe just the stubborn refusal to give up that he'd seen in other survivors. When the paramedics finally arrived, they were as puzzled as Jake by the woman's condition. Her vital signs were stable, though she was severely hypothermic. More mysteriously, a preliminary examination revealed no obvious physical reason for her inability to speak. Her throat showed no signs of injury, and she seemed to understand everything that was said to her. "Has she said anything at all?" asked Sarah Chen, the lead paramedic, as they prepared to transport the woman to the hospital. "Not a word," Jake replied. "Not even a whisper. It's like she's lost her voice completely." "Could be psychological," Sarah mused. "Trauma can manifest in a lot of different ways." As they loaded the woman onto a stretcher, Jake noticed that she kept looking back, toward the dying campfire, her eyes filled with what looked like longing. It was as if she was leaving something important behind, something she might never find again. The local hospital was a small facility that served the scattered communities throughout the valley. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the emergency physician on duty, had seen her share of unusual cases. But Mathelda Williams, as she was eventually identified through missing person reports, presented challenges unlike anything in her medical experience. The missing person report had been filed 3 weeks earlier by Mathelda's landlord in Denver. She'd simply vanished from her apartment, leaving behind all her possessions, including her purse and identification. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of where she might have gone. Or why. The police had assumed she'd left voluntarily, perhaps fleeing some personal crisis, but the woman who'd been found in the wilderness bore little resemblance to the person described in the report. According to her landlord, Mathelda had been a music teacher, known for her beautiful singing voice and her work with local children's choirs. She'd been described as vibrant and outgoing, someone who filled every room she entered with laughter and song. The woman lying in the hospital bed was a shadow of that description. She remained completely mute, responding to questions only with nods or shakes of her head when she responded at all. Medical tests revealed no physical abnormalities. That would explain her condition. Her vocal cords appeared normal, her hearing was perfect, and brain scans showed no signs of injury or neurological damage. Dr. Rodriguez consulted with specialists in Denver, searching for answers. Psychological trauma was the most likely explanation. But even the hospital's consulting psychiatrist was puzzled by the completeness of Mathelda's silence. Most trauma-induced mutism was selective or partial. This was something else entirely. Days passed, and Mathelda remained in the hospital while social services tried to piece together what had happened to her. She was cooperative with the staff, following instructions and accepting care, but she never made a sound, not even involuntary noises like coughing or clearing her throat. It was as if her voice had been surgically removed, though medical examination showed that wasn't possible. The mystery deepened when nurses reported strange occurrences during the night shifts. They would enter Mathelda's room, expecting to find her asleep, only to discover her sitting upright in bed, her lips moving silently as if she were singing. The movements were too complex and rhythmic to be random, clearly following some melody that only she could hear. "It's the strangest thing," Nurse Patricia Williams told Dr. Rodriguez. "She'll do this for hours sometimes, her whole body swaying with whatever music is playing in her head, but not a sound, not even a whisper." One night, Patricia decided to observe more closely. She dimmed the lights and sat quietly in the corner of Mathelda's room, watching as the young woman went through what was clearly an elaborate musical performance. Her hands moved as if she were conducting an invisible orchestra. Her eyes closed in concentration, her face transformed by an expression of pure joy that was heartbreaking to witness. The performance lasted nearly an hour, and when it ended, Mathelda's eyes opened and met Patricia's across the darkened room. For a moment, the two women simply looked at each other, and Patricia felt as if she were glimpsing something profound and beautiful that had been hidden away from the world. After a week in the hospital, it became clear that Mathelda was physically ready for discharge, but questions remained about where she could go and how she could care for herself. Her apartment in Denver had been rented to someone else, and attempts to locate family members had been unsuccessful. She had no close friends who could take her in, and her condition made it difficult for her to communicate her needs or preferences. It was Jake Morrison who ultimately provided a solution. He'd visited Mathelda several times during her hospital stay, feeling a responsibility for her welfare that he couldn't quite explain. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. There was something about her that had gotten under his skin, some quality of resigned grace that reminded him of a wounded bird that had learned to survive without flight. "There's a place," he told Dr. Rodriguez, "about 50 miles north of here, a kind of retreat center run by a group called the Mountain Hope Foundation. They specialize in helping people who've experienced severe trauma. It's not exactly a medical facility, but they have trained counselors and a peaceful environment. Might be exactly what she needs." The Mountain Hope Foundation operated out of a converted ranch in a valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks. The facility housed about 30 residents at any given time, people who were recovering from various forms of trauma and needed time and space to heal. The staff was small but dedicated, led by a woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had pioneered innovative approaches to trauma recovery. When Jake brought Mathelda to the facility, she seemed to recognize something familiar in the mountain setting. For the first time since he'd found her, she showed genuine interest in her surroundings, her eyes taking in the vast expanse of wilderness with what looked like relief. "She'll be safe here," Dr. Vasquez assured Jake as they watched Mathelda slowly walk across the property, her fingers trailing along the wooden fence that surrounded the main compound. We've helped others who've lost their voices to trauma. Sometimes healing happens in ways we don't expect. Over the following weeks, Matilda settled into the routine of the retreat center. She participated in group activities when encouraged, tended to the small garden that provided vegetables for the facility's kitchen, and spent long hours sitting on the porch that overlooked the valley. She remained completely silent, but the staff noticed that she seemed more at peace than when she'd first arrived. It was during her third week at the facility that something remarkable happened. Rebecca Chen, a scout leader from Colorado Springs, had brought her troop to the area for a wilderness survival course. The Mountain Hope Foundation occasionally allowed such groups to use their facilities for educational purposes, and Dr. Vasquez believed that the presence of young people might be therapeutic for some of the residents. Rebecca was an experienced, outdoorswoman who'd been leading scout troops for over 15 years. She'd seen the healing power of nature work its magic on troubled kids, and she understood the deep connection that could exist between the human spirit and the wilderness. What she didn't expect was to encounter a mystery that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the power of silence and song. Rebecca Chen had always possessed what her grandmother called listening ears, the ability to hear sounds that others missed, to pick up on the subtle rhythms and harmonies that existed in the natural world. It was a gift that had served her well during her years as a scout leader, helping her locate lost campers by the sound of their breathing or detect approaching storms by the way birds changed their songs. On this particular morning, as she led her troop of 12 girls through the pine forests surrounding the Mountain Hope Foundation, Rebecca's listening ears picked up something extraordinary. The girls were practicing their wilderness navigation skills, spread out in pairs across a quarter-mile stretch of forest, when she heard it, a melody so pure and haunting that it seemed to emerge from the very heart of the mountains themselves. The song had no words, but it carried emotions that Rebecca felt deep in her chest. Longing, loss, hope, and an aching beauty that brought tears to her eyes. She stopped walking and held up her hand, signaling for the girls to halt their chatter and listen. But when they fell silent, straining to hear what had captured their leader's attention, there was nothing. Only the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. "What is it, Miss Chen?" asked Emma Patterson, one of the older scouts. "Did you hear something?" Rebecca frowned, certain she had heard the melody just moments before. "I thought I heard singing," she said slowly, "but it seems to have stopped." The girls exchanged glances, clearly wondering if their leader was having some kind of breakdown. Rebecca couldn't blame them. She wasn't entirely sure herself what she had experienced. They continued their trek, but Rebecca found herself distracted, her ears constantly scanning for any trace of that ethereal melody. It wasn't until they stopped for lunch near a small clearing that she heard it again, fainter this time, like an echo of an echo, but unmistakably the same haunting tune. This time, Rebecca was determined to find the source. She instructed her assistant leader, Karen Phillips, to supervise the girls while she investigated. Following the sound required all of her tracking skills because the melody seemed to drift and fade with each step she took. Sometimes it appeared to come from her left, sometimes from her right, and occasionally it seemed to emanate from directly above her, as if the singer were perched in the treetops. The pursuit led her closer to the Mountain Hope Foundation facility, through a grove of aspen trees whose leaves shimmered like silver coins in the afternoon sunlight. The melody grew stronger as she approached a small wooden cabin that sat apart from the main buildings, surrounded by a garden filled with late-blooming wildflowers. And there, sitting on a stone bench in the center of the garden, was a young woman with auburn hair who appeared to be singing with her entire being, her body swaying, her hands moving expressively, her face radiant with joy, yet making absolutely no sound. Rebecca stopped at the edge of the garden, transfixed by what she was witnessing. The woman's performance was so complete, so emotionally resonant, that Rebecca could almost hear the melody she was singing. It was as if the music existed in a dimension parallel to the physical world, accessible only to those who knew how to listen with more than their ears. The silent song continued for several more minutes, building to what appeared to be a powerful crescendo, before gradually fading to a whisper. When it ended, the woman, who Rebecca would later learn was named Mathelda, opened her eyes and looked directly at her observer. For a moment, the two women regarded each other across the garden, and Rebecca felt as if she were looking into the eyes of someone who had been carrying an impossible burden for far too long. "That was beautiful," Rebecca said softly, stepping into the garden. "The most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Mathelda's eyes widened with surprise and then filled with tears. She stood up from the bench, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she pressed her hands to her throat, a gesture of frustration and despair that broke Rebecca's heart. "You can't speak," Rebecca said, understanding flooding through her. "But you can still sing, can't you? Not with your voice, but with your soul." Mathelda nodded eagerly, tears streaming down her cheeks. She pointed to her chest, then to her throat, then made a gesture that seemed to encompass the entire world around them. Rebecca interpreted this as Mathelda trying to explain that her music came from within, but couldn't find its way out through conventional means. "My name is Rebecca Chen," she said, moving closer to the bench where Mathelda had been sitting. "I'm a scout leader, and I was hiking with my troop when I heard your song. It was the most incredible thing. I could hear every note, every emotion." "How is that possible?" Mathelda shook her head, indicating that she didn't understand it either. She gestured for Rebecca to sit beside her on the bench, then began to communicate through a series of expressive hand movements and facial expressions. It was like watching an elaborate form of charades. But Rebecca found that she could understand much of what Mathelda was trying to convey. The story that emerged, told in gestures and expressions, was heartbreaking. Mathelda had been a music teacher, someone whose entire identity was built around her voice and her ability to share the joy of music with others. Then something terrible had happened, the exact nature of which remained unclear, and her voice had simply vanished. Not just her speaking voice, but her singing voice as well. The part of her that had defined who she was had been stolen away, leaving her feeling like a ghost of her former self. "But you're still singing," Rebecca insisted. "I can hear it. Maybe not everyone can, but I can. And if I can hear it, that means your music is still alive inside you." Mathelda looked skeptical, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She gestured toward the surrounding forest, then cupped her hands around her ears, asking if Rebecca could really hear her songs when she performed them. "Every note," Rebecca confirmed, "every emotion. It's like nothing I've ever experienced before." Over the next hour, the two women developed a unique form of communication. Mathelda would sing silently, pouring her heart into performances that existed only in the realm of the spirit, while Rebecca would describe what she heard, the melodies, the rhythms, the emotions that each song conveyed. It was an extraordinary collaboration between two very different women who had found a way to bridge the gap between sound and silence. When Rebecca finally had to return to her scout troop, she promised Mathelda that she would come back the next day. The connection they had discovered was too precious to abandon, and Rebecca sensed that Mathelda needed someone who could hear her music almost as much as she needed to sing it. That evening, as Rebecca sat around the campfire with her girls, she found herself thinking about the mysterious woman in the garden. The scouts noticed their leader's distraction and asked if everything was all right. "I met someone today," Rebecca said carefully. "Someone who's lost her voice, but not her music. It made me think about all the different ways we communicate with each other and how sometimes the most important messages can't be spoken out loud." The girls were curious about this cryptic statement, but Rebecca wasn't ready to share the full story of her encounter with Mathelda. She needed time to process what had happened and to figure out how she might be able to help. The next morning, Rebecca left her assistant in charge of the troop's activities and returned to the Mountain Hope Foundation. She found Dr. Elena Vasquez in the facility's main office and introduced herself, explaining that she had met one of the residents and was hoping to learn more about her situation. "Ah, you must mean Mathelda," Dr. Vasquez said when Rebecca described her encounter. "She's been with us for several weeks now. A fascinating case and a tragic one. She was found in the wilderness suffering from severe hypothermia, completely unable to speak or make any sound at all. We believe she's experienced some form of severe psychological trauma, but she's been unable to tell us what happened to her." Rebecca chose her words carefully. "I think I might be able to help with that. I have some experience working with people who have communication difficulties, and I believe Mathelda is trying to communicate in ways that aren't immediately obvious." Dr. Vasquez was intrigued by this suggestion. The facility's staff had been struggling to find ways to connect with Mathelda, and any new approach was worth exploring. She agreed to allow Rebecca to spend time with Mathelda, with the understanding that any interactions would be supervised and documented. When Rebecca returned to the garden, she found Mathelda waiting for her on the same stone bench, as if she had known Rebecca would come back. The young woman's face lit up with joy when she saw her new friend approaching, and she immediately began one of her silent songs. This time, Rebecca paid closer attention to the technical aspects of what she was hearing. The melody was complex, with multiple harmonic layers that seemed to weave together in impossible ways. The rhythm was fluid, sometimes following conventional patterns and sometimes breaking into something entirely new. Most remarkably, the song seemed to respond to the environment around them. When a bird called out from the trees, the melody would incorporate that sound. When the wind picked up, the music would swell to match its intensity. "You're not just singing," Rebecca realized. "You're conducting a symphony of everything around us, the birds, the wind, the rustle of leaves. It's all part of your music." Mathelda nodded enthusiastically, then stood up and began to move through the garden as she sang. Rebecca followed, mesmerized by the way Mathelda seemed to draw music from every element of her surroundings. She would touch a flower and somehow incorporate its essence into her song, or pause beside a small fountain and blend the sound of trickling water into her melody. It was during this musical tour of the garden that Rebecca began to understand the true nature of Mathelda's gift. This wasn't just a woman who had lost her voice. This was someone who had discovered an entirely new way of creating music, one that transcended the limitations of vocal cords and traditional instruments. "Have you always been able to do this?" Rebecca asked when the song ended. Mathelda shook her head, then held up 3 fingers, indicating that this ability had developed recently. She touched her throat, made a gesture indicating loss or absence, then pointed to her heart and gestured outward toward the world around them. Rebecca interpreted this as Mathelda, explaining that when she lost her physical voice, she had somehow gained the ability to create music that connected directly with the spiritual essence of her environment. "It's like you've learned to sing with your soul instead of your voice," Rebecca mused, "and somehow certain people can hear it." Mathelda looked puzzled by this last statement, so Rebecca explained that she seemed to be the only person who could actually hear the melodies that Mathelda was creating. The staff at the facility had noticed Mathelda's silent performances, but they hadn't mentioned hearing any actual music. This revelation clearly troubled Mathelda. She gestured frantically, trying to communicate something complex about her situation. Rebecca gathered that Mathelda was worried about being perceived as mentally ill or delusional, and that the inability to share her music with others was causing her enormous frustration. "You're not crazy," Rebecca assured her. "What you're doing is real and it's beautiful. Maybe not everyone can hear it, but that doesn't make it any less valid. Some people are born with the ability to see colors that others can't, or to hear frequencies that are beyond the normal range. Maybe I just happen to be someone who can tune in to whatever frequency you're broadcasting on." Over the following days, Rebecca spent every free moment with Mathelda, learning to interpret her silent songs and helping her explore the full range of her new abilities. They discovered that Mathelda could create different types of music depending on her emotional state and her physical environment. In the garden, her songs were gentle and nurturing, filled with the essence of growing things. Near the stream that ran through the property, her music became fluid and dynamic, matching the flow of water over rocks. In the forest, her melodies grew deep and complex, incorporating the ancient wisdom of the trees. Most remarkably, Rebecca found that she could sometimes influence Mathelda's songs by focusing her own thoughts and emotions. If she concentrated on feelings of joy, Mathelda's music would become more uplifting. If she thought about sadness or loss, the melodies would turn melancholy and haunting. It was as if they were creating a form of telepathic music together, a collaboration that existed entirely in the realm of the spirit. Dr. Vasquez was fascinated by the reports of these sessions. While she couldn't hear the music that Rebecca described, she could observe the profound changes in Mathelda's demeanor and behavior. The young woman who had arrived at the facility withdrawn and despairing was gradually becoming more animated and engaged with the world around her. "Whatever you're doing with her, it's working," Dr. Vasquez told Rebecca. "She's showing more signs of healing in the past week than she has since she arrived. I think you may have found the key to helping her recover." But Rebecca sensed that there was still something missing, some crucial piece of Mathelda's story that hadn't yet been revealed. The young woman's silent songs were beautiful, but they carried an undercurrent of unresolved pain that suggested her trauma ran deeper than anyone had realized. It was during their second week of musical sessions that Rebecca finally heard something that made her understand the true magnitude of what Mathelda had lost and what she might be able to regain. The breakthrough came on a grey Thursday morning when storm clouds gathered over the mountain peaks, casting the entire valley in an eerie twilight. Rebecca had arrived at the facility earlier than usual, concerned about how the approaching weather might affect Mathelda's fragile emotional state. She found her friend sitting in the garden despite the threatening sky, her face turned upward, toward the dark clouds, with an expression of intense concentration. As Rebecca approached, she began to hear something different in Mathelda's silent song. The melody was darker than usual, filled with discord and fear, but underneath it ran a thread of something else, recognition. It was as if Mathelda was remembering something through her music, using the approaching storm as a catalyst to unlock memories that had been buried deep in her psyche. The first drops of rain began to fall as Rebecca reached the stone bench, but Mathelda made no move to seek shelter. Instead, her silent performance intensified, becoming more complex and emotionally charged with each passing moment. Rebecca could hear layers of music she had never detected before, a children's choir singing in perfect harmony, the sound of a piano accompanying their young voices, and beneath it all, a solo voice of extraordinary beauty leading the ensemble. "That's you," Rebecca whispered, understanding flooding through her. "You're remembering yourself singing with children." Mathelda's eyes snapped open, meeting Rebecca's gaze with a look of profound surprise. For the first time since they had met, she seemed fully present in the moment, no longer lost in the twilight realm between sound and silence. She nodded slowly, then pressed both hands to her chest as if trying to hold on to the memory that was surfacing. The rain was falling harder now, but neither woman moved. Mathelda began to gesture frantically, trying to communicate the images and emotions that were flooding back to her. Rebecca could see that she was reliving something specific, a particular day, a moment in time that had been significant enough to embed itself in her cellular memory despite the trauma that had followed. Through a combination of gestures and her unique form of musical communication, Mathelda began to tell Rebecca about her life before the silence. She had indeed been a music teacher, working primarily with elementary school children in Denver, but her specialty had been working with kids who were considered difficult, children from troubled homes, students with learning disabilities, young people who had been written off by the traditional educational system. The images that emerged through Mathelda's storytelling were vivid and heartbreaking. Rebecca could see her working with a shy little girl who had never spoken in class, gradually coaxing her to join in simple songs until the child's voice emerged like a butterfly from a cocoon. She witnessed Mathelda's patience with a boy who had been labeled as having behavioral problems, discovering that his disruptive outbursts stopped when he was allowed to express himself through rhythm and melody. You weren't just teaching music, Rebecca realized. You were using music to heal. The rain had become a downpour, soaking both women to the skin, but Mathelda's silent performance continued. Now Rebecca could hear something new in the music, the sound of many adult voices joining together, singing with a desperate intensity that spoke of profound loss and grief. It was a memorial service, she realized, and Mathelda had been leading. The music, this was where the story took a dark turn. Through her gestures and the emotions conveyed in her soundless songs, Mathelda revealed that she had been conducting a children's choir at a special memorial concert when tragedy struck. A fire had broken out in the building, trapping dozens of people inside. Mathelda had managed to lead most of the children to safety, but in the chaos and smoke, she had lost track of several of her youngest students. Rebecca could feel the trauma emanating from Mathelda's performance as she relieved that terrible night. The guilt, the horror, the desperate search through smoke-filled corridors for children who were depending on her to keep them safe. She had found 2 of them trapped in a practice room, unconscious from smoke inhalation, and had carried them out one by one. But by the time she returned for the 3rd child, a 7-year-old girl named Lucy, who had just learned to sing her first solo, it was too late. You lost your voice trying to save her, Rebecca said softly, the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together. You screamed for help until your vocal cords were damaged by the smoke and the strain. Mathelda nodded, tears mixing with rainwater on her cheeks. But there was more to the story, and she continued her silent performance despite the emotional pain it was causing her. Rebecca could hear in the music that Mathelda had indeed damaged her vocal cords that night, but the physical injury had healed over time. The silence that had claimed her was psychological, rooted in the guilt and trauma of losing a child she had promised to protect. The final piece of the memory was the most devastating. After months of physical therapy and counseling, Mathelda had recovered enough to attempt singing again. She had been hired to perform at a benefit concert for the families affected by the fire, and she had practiced for weeks, determined to honor the memory of little Lucy and the other victims through her music. But when the moment came, when she stood on stage in front of hundreds of people and opened her mouth to sing, nothing came out. The trauma had created a psychological block so complete that her voice simply refused to work. The humiliation and sense of failure had sent her into a spiral of depression that eventually led to her disappearing from her apartment and wandering into the wilderness where Jake Morrison had found her. "You went to the mountains to die," Rebecca said, her heart breaking for the woman beside her. Mathelda nodded, then made a gesture indicating the campfire where she had been found. She had built that small fire not for warmth, but as a funeral pyre for her former self. She had been waiting for the cold to claim her when Jake had interrupted her final performance, a silent goodbye to the music that had once defined her entire existence. The storm was reaching its peak now, lightning illuminating the garden in stark flashes while thunder rolled across the valley, but something remarkable was happening to Mathelda's silent performance. The music that Rebecca could hear was beginning to change, transforming from a lament of loss into something that sounded almost like hope. "You survived," Rebecca said, understanding the shift in the melody. "You were meant to survive." For the first time since Rebecca had known her, Mathelda attempted to speak. Her lips moved, forming what looked like words, and while no sound emerged, Rebecca could somehow hear what she was trying to say. "Lucy forgives me." The revelation hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Mathelda's extraordinary ability to create music that existed beyond the physical realm wasn't just a compensation for her lost voice. It was a gift that allowed her to communicate with something beyond the material world. The child she had been unable to save had somehow found a way to reach her through the music, offering the forgiveness that Mathelda had been unable to give herself. "She's been trying to tell you all along," Rebecca whispered. "Through your music, she's been trying to let you know that what happened wasn't your fault." Dr. Vasquez found them an hour later, still sitting in the garden, despite being completely soaked by the storm. She was initially concerned about their exposure to the elements, but when she saw the expression on Mathelda's face, peaceful for the first time since her arrival at the facility, she understood that something significant had occurred. "We need to get you both inside and into dry clothes," the doctor said practically, but she made no move to hurry them. She could sense that they were in the middle of something important, a breakthrough that shouldn't be interrupted. As they finally made their way inside, Rebecca noticed that Mathelda's posture had changed. She no longer carried herself like someone who was broken and defeated. There was a straightness to her spine, a purposefulness to her movements that suggested she had rediscovered something essential about herself. Over the next few days, the transformation in Mathelda became even more pronounced. While she still couldn't speak aloud, she began to communicate more actively with the staff and other residents at the facility. Her silent songs became more frequent and more joyful, and Rebecca noticed that other people were beginning to respond to them, even if they couldn't hear the actual music. Dr. Vasquez documented these changes with fascination. "It's as if she's rediscovered her identity as a healer," the doctor observed. "She's starting to use her musical abilities to help other residents work through their own trauma." This was indeed what was happening. Mathelda had begun to seek out other people at the facility who were struggling with their recovery, offering her presence and her silent songs as a form of comfort. A Vietnam veteran, suffering from severe PTSD, found that his nightmares diminished when Mathelda sat quietly beside his bed in the evenings, her soundless melodies somehow penetrating his troubled sleep. A teenage girl who had been refusing to eat began to show interest in food again after spending afternoons in the garden with Mathelda. "She's becoming a music therapist again," Rebecca realized, "just not in any way that's ever been done before." The most remarkable development came when Mathelda began working with a group of children from a local elementary school who visited the facility as part of a community outreach program. These were kids who had been identified as having various emotional and behavioral challenges, and they were participating in a program designed to help them develop coping skills through interaction with nature and animals. When the children first encountered Mathelda, they were initially puzzled by her silence. But kids, Rebecca observed, seemed to have less difficulty accepting the unusual than adults did. Within minutes of meeting her, they were following her around the facility like a pack of devoted puppies, somehow sensing that she was someone who understood them in a way that most adults didn't. Mathelda began to create special performances for the children, silent concerts that took place in different locations around the facility. She would lead them to the vegetable garden and create music that celebrated growth and nurturing. In the meadow behind the main building, her songs spoke of freedom and possibility. By the stream, she wove melodies that captured the joy of flowing water and the persistence of nature. The children couldn't hear the actual music any more than the adults could, but they responded to something in Mathelda's performances that transcended sound. They would sit in rapt attention during her concerts, and afterward they would talk excitedly about the feelings they had experienced, colors they had seen, emotions they had felt, stories that had somehow been communicated without words. "It's like she's found a way to touch people's souls directly," Rebecca told Dr. Vasquez. "She's bypassed the need for traditional communication and gone straight to something deeper." The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "In some ways, what she's doing now might be more powerful than what she could do with her voice. She's connecting with people on a level that goes beyond language, beyond sound, beyond all the barriers that usually separate us from each other." But Rebecca sensed that Mathelda's journey was far from complete. The breakthrough in the garden during the storm had unlocked her memories and helped her process her guilt, but there was still something missing. She was healing others, but she hadn't yet found a way to fully heal herself. The answer came from an unexpected source, a letter that arrived at the facility addressed to Mathelda Williams. It had been forwarded through several addresses, having taken weeks to finally reach her. The return address showed it was from the Denver Children's Memorial Foundation, an organization that had been established to honor the victims of the fire that had claimed young Lucy's life. When Dr. Vasquez brought Mathelda the letter, the young woman stared at it for a long time before finally opening it. Rebecca was present during this moment, and she could hear the shift in Mathelda's silent music as she read. A melody that began in fear and apprehension, but gradually transformed into something that sounded like wonder. The letter was from Lucy's parents, who had been searching for Mathelda ever since her disappearance. They had learned about her work with troubled children, her heroic efforts to save as many kids as possible during the fire, and the guilt that had driven her to vanish from her life. They wanted her to know that they didn't blame her for Lucy's death, and they had a request that would change everything. The letter from Thomas and Margaret Henley, Lucy's parents, contained words that would echo in Mathelda's heart for days to come. Written in Margaret's careful handwriting, it spoke of forgiveness, understanding, and an opportunity that neither Mathelda nor Rebecca could have anticipated. "Dear Miss Williams," the letter began, "we have been searching for you since you disappeared 6 months ago. We know what happened that terrible night, and we know about the guilt you've been carrying. We want you to understand that we have never blamed you for Lucy's death. You saved 17 children that night, including our neighbor's twin boys, who are alive today because of your courage." Mathelda's hands trembled as she read, and Rebecca could hear the emotional storm in her silent music. Waves of disbelief, relief, and a grief so profound it seemed to encompass the entire mountain valley around them. The letter continued. "Lucy spoke about you constantly in the weeks before the concert. She was so proud to be chosen for her first solo, and she practiced every day because she wanted to make you proud. We believe she would want her memory to honor what you were trying to build, a place where music could heal children who had nowhere else to turn. The most remarkable part came in the final paragraphs. The Henleys had established the Lucy Rose Foundation in their daughter's memory, dedicated to creating innovative music therapy programs for at-risk children. They had purchased a 40-acre property in the Colorado mountains, complete with residential facilities, recording studios, and outdoor performance spaces. But they lacked something essential, someone with the vision and experience to make their dream a reality. "We believe Lucy led us to this letter, just as she may have led you through your own dark valley toward healing," Margaret had written. "We would like to offer you the position of director of the Lucy Rose Foundation. We know you have lost your voice, but we believe you have found something even more powerful, a way to touch children's hearts that goes beyond words or conventional music." The letter included photographs of the foundation property, and Rebecca gasped when she saw them. The main building was a beautifully restored mountain lodge, surrounded by gardens and meadows that looked like something from a fairy tale. There were smaller cabins scattered throughout the property, designed to house children during extended programs. Most striking was the outdoor amphitheater, carved into a natural depression in the landscape and surrounded by towering pine trees. "They want you to create a new kind of music therapy program," Rebecca said, studying the photos. "A place where children can heal through whatever form of music speaks to them, whether it's traditional singing or something completely different." Mathelda looked at the images with a mixture of wonder and terror. The opportunity was everything she had dreamed of before the fire, but the thought of taking responsibility for other people's children again filled her with anxiety. What if she failed them? What if her unique abilities weren't enough to help kids who were dealing with serious trauma? Dr. Vasquez, who had been reading the letter over their shoulders, offered a different perspective. "Perhaps the question isn't whether you're ready for this responsibility," she suggested gently. "Perhaps the question is whether these children are ready for what you have to offer." Over the next several days, Mathelda wrestled with the decision. She spent long hours in the garden, her silent songs reflecting the turmoil in her heart. Rebecca could hear the internal debate playing out in the music, melodies of hope battling themes of fear, crescendos of possibility colliding with quiet passages of doubt. The breakthrough came when the weekly group of local children arrived for their visit to the Mountain Hope Foundation. Among them was a new face, a 10-year-old boy named Marcus Washington, who had been added to the program at the last minute. Marcus had been through the foster care system for 3 years following his parents' death in a car accident, and his current placement was in jeopardy due to his increasingly aggressive behavior at school. When the children gathered in the garden for Mathelda's usual silent concert, Marcus stood apart from the group, his arms crossed and his expression defiant. He made it clear through his body language that he had no interest in whatever weird activity the adults had planned for him. Mathelda noticed his isolation immediately, and Rebecca could hear her music shift to accommodate the presence of a wounded child. The melody became gentler, more patient, with an underlying current that seemed to acknowledge Marcus's pain without trying to force him to participate. As the silent concert continued, something remarkable happened. Despite his apparent disinterest, Marcus began to move closer to the group. At first, it was just a step or two, as if he was simply getting a better view. But gradually, almost unconsciously, he found himself drawn into the circle of children who were listening to Mathelda's soundless performance. When the music ended, Marcus surprised everyone by walking directly up to Mathelda. He stared at her. For a long moment, his young face serious and thoughtful, before speaking the first words anyone had heard him say all day. "You're singing about being alone, aren't you?" he said. "About what it feels like when nobody wants you." Mathelda's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly. Without thinking, she reached out and placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. The boy didn't pull away, which surprised the adults who had been warned about his difficulty with physical contact. "I can't hear the music like the other kids say they can," Marcus continued, "but I can feel it. It feels like you understand what it's like to lose everything. What happened next would forever change Matilda's understanding of her own abilities." She began another silent song, but this time she directed it specifically at Marcus, creating a musical dialogue between his pain and her own. Rebecca could hear the conversation unfolding, Matilda's music asking questions about his fears and anger, Marcus's body language providing answers that Matilda somehow incorporated into her. Next, musical phrases. The other children watched in fascination as this wordless communication took place. Even they could sense that something special was happening, though they couldn't articulate exactly what it was. Marcus stood perfectly still throughout the exchange, his expression gradually softening as Matilda's music seemed to acknowledge and validate his emotional struggles. When the song ended, Marcus did something that shocked his caseworker and the facility staff. He hugged Matilda, not a brief, obligatory embrace, but a real hug that spoke of a child who had finally found someone who truly understood his pain. "Will you still be here next week?" he asked her. Matilda looked at Rebecca, then at Dr. Vasquez, and finally back at Marcus. She nodded, but Rebecca could hear in her silent response that she was making a much larger commitment than just promising to be present for the next visit. That evening, Matilda asked Dr. Vasquez to help her compose a response to the Henleys' letter. Working together, they crafted a message that accepted the position at the Lucy Rose Foundation, with the understanding that Matilda would need time to develop her unique approach to music therapy and that the program would be unlike anything that had been attempted before. "I want to create a place where children can discover their own ways of making music," Matilda's letter stated, dictated to Dr. Vasquez, but expressing thoughts that came entirely from her heart. "Some will sing with their voices, others will find instruments that speak for them, and some may discover forms of musical expression that don't involve sound at all. The goal will be to help each child find their authentic voice, whatever form that voice may take." The Henleys' response came within a week, expressing their excitement about Matilda's vision and their eagerness to begin the process of establishing the Foundation's programs. They had already hired a small staff of counselors and support personnel, and they were prepared to invest whatever resources were necessary to make Matilda's vision a reality. As plans for the transition began to take shape, Rebecca found herself facing her own difficult decision. Her work with Matilda had awakened something in her that she hadn't known existed, a sensitivity to forms of communication that went beyond words and conventional music. The Lucy Rose Foundation would need people who could serve as interpreters between Matilda's unique abilities and the children she would be working with. "I think I'm being called to something new," Rebecca told her scout troop during their final evening around the campfire. "I've been offered a position at a foundation that will be working with children who need specialized help, and I feel like this is what I'm meant to do." The girls were sad to lose their beloved leader, but they could see the excitement in Rebecca's eyes and understood that she was following her heart towards something important. The transition to the Lucy Rose Foundation took place over the course of 6 weeks. During that time, Matilda worked with Dr. Vasquez to document her unique therapeutic approach, creating a framework that other potential practitioners might be able to learn from. They discovered that while Matilda's specific abilities seemed to be one of a kind, there were aspects of her method that could be taught to others. The key was learning to listen with more than just the ears, to pay attention to the subtle cues that children gave through their body language, their breathing patterns, their posture, and their interactions with their environment. Mathilda had developed an almost supernatural ability to read these non-verbal communications and respond to them through her silent music, creating a form of therapy that reached children on a level that traditional approaches often missed. On the day of her departure from the Mountain Hope Foundation, Mathilda was surprised by a farewell gathering that included all the residents and staff, as well as the group of local children who had come to know her. Marcus was there, along with his caseworker, who had requested permission to bring him to say goodbye to the woman who had somehow managed to reach him when no one else could. The gathering took place in the garden where Mathilda had first met Rebecca, and she offered one final silent concert for the people who had become her extended family. Rebecca could hear that this performance was different from all the others. It was a song of gratitude, a musical thank you note to everyone who had helped her find her way back to herself. But there was something else in the music, something that made Rebecca's heart race with anticipation. Buried deep in the melody was a theme that sounded like the beginning of a new story, the first notes of a symphony that would take years to complete. Mathilda wasn't just saying goodbye. She was announcing the start of a new chapter in her life, one that would honor Lucy's memory while helping countless other children find their own paths to healing. As the silent concert ended, Marcus stepped forward and handed Mathilda a folded piece of paper. When she opened it, she found a drawing he had made of her sitting in the garden, surrounded by children and musical notes that seemed to float in the air around her. At the bottom of the page, in carefully printed letters, he had written, "Thank you for hearing my quiet song." The gift moved Mathilda to tears, and for a moment Rebecca thought she might actually hear her friend's voice break through the silence that had claimed it. But instead, Mathilda began one more song, a brief, simple melody that somehow managed to encompass all the hope and possibility that lay ahead. The Lucy Rose Foundation property was even more beautiful than the photographs had suggested. Nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks, it felt like a place where magic might actually be possible. The main lodge had been renovated with care, preserving its rustic charm while adding modern amenities and accessibility features. The recording studios were state-of-the-art, equipped with instruments from around the world and technology that could capture even the most subtle musical expressions. But it was the outdoor amphitheater that took Mathilda's breath away. Built into the natural contours of the mountainside, it felt less like a human construction than like a sacred space that had always existed. The acoustics were perfect, designed to carry even the softest sounds to every seat, and the view from the stage encompassed the entire valley. "Lucy would have loved this place," Margaret Henley said, as she showed Mathilda around the property. "She always said that music sounded better when it was surrounded by nature." The first group of children would arrive in just 2 weeks, and Mathilda felt the familiar mixture of excitement and terror that had once preceded every new semester of teaching. But this time, she also felt something new, a deep sense of purpose that seemed to emanate from the very mountains around her. She was no longer the broken woman who had been found freezing beside a dying campfire. She was someone who had journeyed through silence and emerged with a gift that could help others find their own voices, whatever form those voices might take. The real work was just beginning. The morning of the Lucy Rose Foundation's inaugural program dawned crisp and clear, with golden sunlight streaming through the pine trees and painting the mountain peaks in shades of rose and amber. Mathilda stood on the porch of the main lodge, watching as a convoy of vehicles made their way up the winding mountain road. Each car carried a child whose life had been touched by trauma, loss, or challenges that traditional therapy had failed to address. Rebecca joined her on the porch, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and wearing the same mixture of excitement and apprehension that Mathilda felt in her own heart. Over the past 2 weeks, They had worked together to prepare for this moment, creating programs and activities that would allow each child to explore their own relationship with music and healing. 12 children, Rebecca said, handing Mathilda her coffee. Ages 7 to 16. Each one carries their own story, their own pain, their own potential for healing. The first vehicle to arrive was a van from a children's home in Denver, carrying 4 siblings who had been in the system for 3 years, following their parents' overdose deaths. The oldest, 15-year-old Destiny Rodriguez, helped her younger brothers and sister out of the van with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly. 8-year-old twins Carlos and Miguel clung to each other with the instinctive protectiveness of children who had learned that the world was not always safe. Their sister Isabella, just 7 years old, clutched a battered stuffed elephant that had clearly seen better days. Behind them came Marcus Washington, whose caseworker had specifically requested his inclusion in the program after witnessing his breakthrough with Mathilda at the Mountain Hope Foundation. He emerged from the car with the same guarded expression he had worn during their first meeting, but Mathilda could see something different in his posture, a subtle openness that suggested he was willing to give this place a chance. The other arrivals included children from various backgrounds and circumstances. There was Lily Chen, a 13-year-old pianist whose performance anxiety had become so severe that she could no longer play in front of anyone, not even her own family. Jason Miller, 11 years old, had been selectively mute since witnessing his father's suicide 2 years earlier. 16-year-old Aisha Johnson had been referred by her school counselor after a series of angry outbursts that seemed to be connected to her inability to process her grandmother's recent death. Each child brought their own protective barriers, their own coping mechanisms, their own reasons for believing that music or anything else couldn't possibly help them heal from their wounds. As they gathered in the main lodge for orientation, Mathilda could feel the collective weight of their skepticism and pain. Thomas and Margaret Henley were present for the opening ceremony, along with a small group of staff members who would be supporting the program. Margaret stepped forward to welcome the children, her voice warm but tinged with the emotion that always surfaced when she spoke about her daughter's legacy. "Welcome to the Lucy Rose Foundation," she began. "This place exists because we believe that music has the power to heal wounds that nothing else can reach. Some of you may think that's impossible, that your pain is too deep or too complicated for something as simple as music to make a difference. That's okay. We're not asking you to believe anything right now. We're just asking you to be open to possibilities you might not have considered before." She gestured toward Mathilda, who stood quietly at the side of the room. "Miss Williams is going to be your guide during the next 2 weeks. She has her own story of loss and healing, and she's discovered some remarkable ways to help people find their voices, even when they think those voices are lost forever." The children studied Mathilda with the keen observation skills that traumatized kids often develop. They could sense that she was different from other adults they had encountered, but they weren't sure what that difference meant or whether they could trust it. Mathilda stepped forward and began her first silent song of the program. Rebecca could hear immediately that this performance was unlike any other she had witnessed. The melody seemed to reach out individually to each child in the room, acknowledging their specific pain while offering gentle reassurance that they were safe in this place. The response was immediate and varied. Some children, like Marcus, seemed to relax visibly as the silent music washed over them. Others, particularly the older ones like Destiny and Aisha, appeared to become more guarded, as if they were resisting any attempt to reach them emotionally. Little Isabella stopped clutching her stuffed elephant quite so tightly, while Jason Miller actually looked directly at Mathilda for the first time since arriving. When the song ended, Mathilda gestured for the children to follow her outside. The next part of the orientation would take place in the natural amphitheater, where each child would have the opportunity to experience the space and begin to understand what they would be working with during their stay. The walk to the amphitheater became an informal introduction to the Foundation's approach. Instead of lecturing about rules and schedules, Mathelda simply moved through the property, pausing at various locations to offer brief, silent performances that seemed to capture the essence of each space. At the vegetable garden, her music spoke of growth and patience. Near the stream that ran along the eastern edge of the property, her melodies captured the persistence and adaptability of flowing water. Rebecca walked alongside the group, serving as an interpreter when needed and helping the children understand what they were experiencing. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when a child was beginning to connect with Mathelda's unique form of communication. "She's not actually making any sound," observed Lily Chen, the young pianist. "But I can feel something. Like there's music in the air that I can't quite hear." "That's exactly right," Rebecca confirmed. "Miss Williams creates music that speaks directly to your heart instead of your ears. Some people are more sensitive to it than others, but everyone can feel something if they pay attention." When they reached the amphitheater, Mathelda positioned herself at the center of the stage, while the children found seats scattered throughout the curved rows of benches. The setting was magical, with afternoon sunlight filtering through the pine trees and creating patterns of light and shadow across the natural stage. What followed was Mathelda's most ambitious silent performance to date. She created a musical story that seemed to encompass the entire history of human struggle and healing, beginning with themes of loss and pain that gradually transformed into melodies of hope and renewal. Rebecca could hear layers of complexity that spoke to different age groups and different types of trauma, as if Mathelda were somehow customizing the music for each listener simultaneously. The children's responses varied dramatically. Carlos and Miguel, the 8-year-old twins, began to sway gently in their seats, their natural connection to rhythm overriding their defensive barriers. Destiny, the 15-year-old who had taken on adult responsibilities far too young, wiped away tears that she probably didn't realize she was shedding. Jason Miller, who hadn't spoken in 2 years, began to mouth words silently, as if he were singing along to a song only he could hear. The most dramatic response came from Aisha, the 16-year-old who had been struggling with anger issues. About halfway through Mathelda's performance, she stood up abruptly and walked out of the amphitheater, her body language radiating hostility and rejection. Rebecca started to follow her, but Mathelda shook her head slightly, indicating that they should let the girl go for now. When the performance ended, the remaining children sat in stunned silence for several minutes. They had experienced something unprecedented, something that defied their usual categories of understanding. Even the most skeptical among them couldn't deny that something significant had just occurred. "How does she do that?" asked Marcus, breaking the silence. "How can you hear music when she's not making any sound?" Rebecca had been preparing for this question, knowing that the children would need some kind of explanation that made sense to their young minds. "Think about dreams," she said. "When you're dreaming, you can see things and hear things that aren't really there, but they feel completely real. Miss Williams has learned to create a kind of waking dream through her music, something that reaches the part of your mind where dreams and emotions live." Over the following days, the children began to explore their own relationships with music and healing. The Foundation's program was designed to be completely flexible, allowing each participant to discover their own path rather than forcing them into predetermined activities. Some children gravitated toward traditional instruments. Lily Chen, despite her performance anxiety, found herself drawn to the Foundation's collection of unusual percussion instruments from around the world. Playing rhythms on African drums and Tibetan singing bowls somehow felt different from sitting at a piano. Less exposed and more connected to something primal and healing. The Rodriguez siblings discovered that they could create music together in ways that strengthened their bond as a family unit. Carlos and Miguel began composing simple songs about their experiences in foster care, while Isabella used finger paints to create colorful representations of the melodies she heard in her imagination. Their older sister Destiny initially resisted participating, but she gradually began helping her younger siblings with their musical projects, finding healing in her role as protector and guide. Jason Miller's breakthrough came during his 4th day at the foundation. He had been attending Mathelda's daily sessions without participating, seemingly content to simply observe. But during a particularly moving, silent performance in the gardens, he suddenly began to vocalize, not words, but pure sound that seemed to harmonize with whatever music he was hearing in Mathelda's performance. The moment was electric. Rebecca could hear how Jason's voice blended with Mathelda's silent melody, creating a duet that existed on multiple levels of reality. The other children stopped what they were doing to listen, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. From that day forward, Jason began to find his voice again, starting with wordless vocalizations during Mathelda's performances and gradually building toward actual speech. His progress was slow but steady, as if he were testing each word to make sure it was safe before allowing it to emerge. The most challenging case was Aisha, who continued to resist most attempts to engage her in the program. She attended the required sessions, but maintained an attitude of hostile skepticism, making it clear that she considered the entire enterprise to be a waste of time. Rebecca could see that Mathelda was deeply concerned about reaching this particular child, sensing that Aisha's anger was masking pain that went far deeper than anyone realized. The breakthrough came during the program's 2nd week, when a sudden mountain storm forced all activities indoors. The children were gathered in the main lodge, restless and slightly anxious about the lightning and thunder outside. Mathelda began a spontaneous performance designed to calm their fears, but something unexpected happened. As her silent music filled the room, Aisha suddenly erupted in fury. "Stop it!" she shouted, jumping to her feet. "Stop pretending you can fix everything with your fake music. You don't know anything about real pain." The outburst shocked everyone in the room, but Mathelda didn't stop her performance. Instead, she seemed to incorporate Aisha's anger into her music, creating a dialogue between the girl's rage and her own understanding of loss. Rebecca could hear the conversation unfolding, Mathelda's music asking gentle questions, Aisha's body language and vocalizations providing angry answers, Mathelda responding with melodies that acknowledged and validated the girl's pain without trying to diminish it. The exchange continued for nearly 10 minutes, with Aisha alternately shouting and sobbing, while Mathelda's silent music held space for every emotion. Finally, exhausted by her own fury, Aisha collapsed back into her chair and began to tell her story. The pain she had been carrying was almost unbearable. Her grandmother, who had raised her after her parents' abandonment, had died in a nursing home while Aisha was away at summer camp. The girl had never had the chance to say goodbye, never been able to tell her grandmother how much she loved her. The guilt and grief had transformed into rage, because anger felt safer than the devastating sadness underneath. As Aisha spoke, Mathelda continued her silent performance, weaving the girl's words into a musical tapestry that somehow made the pain more bearable. By the end of the session, Aisha was crying freely for the first time since her grandmother's death, finally allowing herself to grieve properly. The transformation in the group dynamic after Aisha's breakthrough was remarkable. The children began to support each other in ways that the staff had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. They created informal music groups, helped each other work through difficult emotions, and developed a sense of community that extended beyond the formal program. Activities. On the final day of the 2-week session, the children organized their own concert in the natural amphitheater. Each participant performed something that represented their journey of healing. Some sang, others played instruments, and a few offered their own versions of silent music inspired by Mathelda's example. The most moving performance came from Jason Miller, who stood at the center of the stage and spoke his first complete sentences in 2 years. "My name is Jason," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I lost my voice when my dad died, but I found it again in the silence. I want to thank Miss Williams for showing me that music doesn't always need sound, and that healing doesn't always need words." As the concert ended and the children prepared to return to their regular lives, Rebecca could see that each of them was leaving the foundation with something precious, not just tools for coping with their trauma, but a new understanding of their own resilience and potential. Mathelda stood at the edge of the amphitheater, watching as the families and caseworkers arrived to pick up their children. Margaret Henley joined her, tears streaming down her cheeks as she witnessed the transformation that had taken place over the past 2 weeks. "Lucy would be so proud," Margaret whispered. "This is exactly what she would have wanted her legacy to be." As the last car disappeared down the mountain road, Mathelda began one final silent song, a melody of gratitude and hope that seemed to encompass everything she had learned about loss, healing, and the power of finding one's voice in unexpected ways. Rebecca could hear in the music that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The Lucy Rose Foundation would welcome many more children in the months and years to come, each one carrying their own story of pain and potential. And somewhere in the silence between sound and healing, Lucy's spirit seemed to smile, knowing that her brief life had planted seeds that would bloom in the hearts of countless children for generations to come. 3 months after the first session at the Lucy Rose Foundation, word of Mathelda's extraordinary work had begun to spread through professional networks in ways that surprised everyone involved. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the emergency physician who had first treated Mathelda at the Mountain Hospital, received a call from a colleague at Children's Hospital Colorado who had heard rumors about a revolutionary music therapy program producing unprecedented results. "I've got a case that's stumping everyone," Dr. Sarah Martinez explained during their phone conversation. "A 9-year-old boy named David Kim who hasn't spoken since witnessing a shooting 6 months ago. We've tried every conventional approach, traditional, and therapy, play therapy, art therapy, even hypnosis. Nothing's working, and his parents are desperate. I heard through the grapevine that you know someone who specializes in unusual cases involving voice loss." Dr. Rodriguez hesitated. She had been following Mathelda's progress through informal updates from colleagues, but she wasn't sure if the foundation was ready to take on cases that were being referred by major medical institutions. The pressure and scrutiny that would come with such referrals could potentially undermine the delicate work that Mathelda was doing. "Let me make some calls," she told Dr. Martinez. "But I want you to understand that what this woman does isn't conventional therapy. It's something entirely different, and I'm not sure anyone fully understands how it works." When Dr. Rodriguez contacted the Lucy Rose Foundation, she found that Mathelda and Rebecca had been wrestling with similar questions about the future direction of their program. The success of the first session had led to a flood of applications from families across the country, many of whom were dealing with children whose cases had been deemed hopeless by traditional therapeutic approaches. "We're getting requests from as far away as Boston and Los Angeles," Rebecca told Dr. Rodriguez during their phone conversation. Parents who are willing to travel across the country and pay any amount of money for the chance that Mathelda might be able to help their children. It's overwhelming, and we're not sure we're equipped to handle this kind of demand. The challenge was that Mathelda's approach couldn't be easily scaled up or replicated. Her unique ability to create healing music in the realm of silence appeared to be one of a kind, and attempts to train other therapists in similar techniques had met with limited success. While some practitioners could learn to be more sensitive to non-verbal cues and to create more intuitive therapeutic environments, none had been able to duplicate Mathelda's specific gift. Thomas and Margaret Henley faced their own dilemma. They had established the foundation with the intention of helping as many children as possible, but they were beginning to realize that Mathelda's abilities might be too rare and precious to be spread thin across countless cases. The question was whether they should focus on serving a smaller number of children with intensive long-term programs, or try to find ways to reach more families with shorter, less intensive interventions. The decision was ultimately made by Mathelda herself, though not in the way anyone expected. During a staff meeting in late September, she presented a proposal that no one had anticipated. Working with Rebecca as her interpreter, she outlined a vision for expanding the Foundation's impact that went far beyond traditional therapy sessions. "I want to train other people to hear the silence," Mathelda communicated through her combination of gestures and silent music. "Not to replicate exactly what I do, but to develop their own sensitivity to the kinds of communication that exist beyond words and conventional sound." Her proposal involved creating a residential training program for therapists, teachers, counselors, and other professionals who worked with traumatized children. The program would combine intensive workshops on nonverbal communication with immersive experiences in the Foundation's natural setting. Participants would learn to recognize and respond to the subtle signals that children send when they're unable to express their pain through traditional means. "It's not about teaching people to hear silent music," Rebecca explained to the gathered staff. "It's about teaching them to listen with their whole beings, to pick up on the emotional frequencies that traumatized children broadcast when they can't find words for their experiences." The first professional training session was scheduled for November, with 12 participants selected from nearly 200 applications. The group included child psychologists, music therapists, special education teachers, and social workers from across the United States and Canada. Each participant had been chosen not only for their professional qualifications, but for their demonstrated sensitivity to alternative forms of communication and their willingness to challenge conventional therapeutic approaches. Dr. Elena Vasquez, from the Mountain Hope Foundation, was among the selected participants, driven by her desire to better understand the transformative work she had witnessed during Mathelda's stay at her facility. Also included was Patricia Williams, the nurse who had observed Mathelda's silent performances during her hospitalization, and Jake Morrison, the forest ranger who had first discovered her by the dying campfire. The training program proved to be unlike anything the participants had experienced before. Rather than lectures and demonstrations, the sessions were structured as immersive experiences that challenged the participants to expand their perceptual abilities. Mathelda would create silent performances while the trainees practiced different forms of listening, not just with their ears, but with their entire nervous systems. "Pay attention to what your body tells you," Rebecca guided them during one particularly intense session. "Notice how your breathing changes, how your posture shifts, how your emotional state responds to what Mathelda is communicating. These physical responses are your gateway to understanding what the children you work with are experiencing when they can't find words." The breakthrough for many participants came during the program's 4th day, when Mathelda invited them to work with a group of local children who had been dealing with various forms of trauma. Instead of observing from a distance, the trainees were asked to interact directly with the children, while Matilda created her silent music to facilitate the connections. Dr. Vasquez found herself working with a 7-year-old girl named Sophia, who had been selectively mute since her parents' bitter divorce. As Matilda's silent performance filled the space around them, Dr. Vasquez began to notice subtle changes in Sophia's breathing and posture that she had never observed before. The child wasn't just sitting passively, she was responding to something, communicating through micro-expressions and minute body movements that revealed the depth of her emotional distress. "I can see her pain," Dr. Vasquez whispered to Rebecca. "I can actually see how much she's hurting, even though she's not making a sound." This was exactly the kind of breakthrough that Matilda had hoped to facilitate. By teaching professionals to recognize these subtle forms of communication, she was creating a network of people who could serve as bridges between her unique abilities and the countless children who needed help but couldn't access the foundation directly. Jake Morrison had his own revelation during a session in the outdoor amphitheater. Working with a 10-year-old boy who had witnessed domestic violence, Jake found that his years of experience reading the subtle signs of the natural world had prepared him to detect the equally subtle signals that traumatized children send when they're trying to communicate their needs. It's like tracking, he realized. You learn to notice the smallest signs: a bent blade of grass, a disturbed pebble, a scent on the wind. These kids are leaving similar tracks, emotional signs that show where they've been and what they've experienced. By the end of the week-long training program, all 12 participants had experienced some form of breakthrough in their ability to connect with children who were struggling to communicate their trauma. More importantly, they had developed a shared vocabulary for describing and working with these alternative forms of expression. The impact of this first training session extended far beyond the immediate participants. Each professional returned to their home institutions with new skills and perspectives that began to influence their colleagues and students. Dr. Vasquez implemented new protocols at the Mountain Hope Foundation based on what she had learned. Patricia Williams started a support group for hospital staff who worked with non-verbal patients. Jake Morrison began volunteering with a wilderness therapy program for at-risk youth. Most significantly, several of the participants began to identify children in their own communities who might benefit from the Foundation's services. This led to the development of a referral network that allowed the Lucy Rose Foundation to have a much broader impact than would have been possible through direct services alone. The case of David Kim, the 9-year-old boy whose selective mutism had prompted Dr. Rodriguez's initial inquiry, became one of the first major successes of this expanded approach. Rather than bringing David to the Foundation, Matilda and Rebecca traveled to Denver to work with him in his own environment, assisted by Dr. Martinez, who had completed the Foundation's training program. David's case was particularly challenging because his trauma was recent and severe. He had been playing in a neighborhood park when a gang shooting erupted around him, and he had witnessed a teenager being killed just a few feet away. The shock had been so profound that David had simply stopped speaking, though medical examinations showed no physical damage to his vocal cords. When Matilda first met David at the hospital, she could immediately sense the depth of his terror through the silent songs that seemed to emanate from his small, rigid body. His emotional state was broadcasting a kind of frozen scream, a continuous signal of panic and helplessness that had been trapped inside him since the moment of the shooting. Working with Dr. Martinez, who had learned to recognize these subtle, emotional signals during her training at the Foundation, Matilda began a careful process of musical dialogue with David. Her silent performances acknowledged his fear without trying to diminish it, creating a safe space where his trauma could be witnessed and validated. The breakthrough came during their third session, when David suddenly began to hum, along with what he was hearing in Mathelda's silent music. The humming was soft and tentative at first, but it gradually grew stronger as David realized that he could add his own voice to the healing conversation that was taking place. Within 2 weeks, David was speaking again, haltingly at first, but with increasing confidence as he learned to trust that his voice was safe. Dr. Martinez documented the entire process, creating what would become the first formal case study of Mathelda's unique therapeutic approach. The success of David's treatment led to increased interest from the medical community, but it also raised new questions about how to handle the growing demand for Mathelda's services. Media attention began to focus on the foundation, with journalists and researchers seeking to understand and document what they were calling silence therapy, or telepathic music healing. Mathelda found the attention deeply uncomfortable. She had never sought fame or recognition for her abilities, and she was concerned that too much publicity might interfere with the delicate work of healing that was taking place at the foundation. More troubling was the fact that some of the media coverage was sensationalizing her story, presenting her as some kind of mystical healer, rather than someone who had simply learned to communicate in a different way. The situation reached a crisis point when a national television news program requested permission to film a documentary about the Foundation's work. The exposure would have been invaluable for raising awareness and funding, but Mathelda was adamant that cameras and reporters would destroy the atmosphere of trust and safety that was essential to her therapeutic approach. The children need to know that their healing process is private and sacred. She communicated to the Foundation's board of directors through Rebecca's interpretation. They can't be vulnerable and authentic if they're worried about being turned into entertainment. For television viewers, the board ultimately decided to decline the television opportunity, choosing instead to focus on professional publications and academic conferences where Mathelda's work could be discussed in a more serious and scientific context. This decision proved to be wise, as it allowed the Foundation to maintain its therapeutic focus while still contributing to the broader understanding of alternative healing approaches. As winter settled over the Colorado mountains, the Foundation prepared for its second major program session. This time, they would be working with 16 children whose cases had been referred through their growing network of trained professionals. The group included several children with autism spectrum disorders, others dealing with the effects of abuse and neglect, and a few whose communication challenges stemmed from neurological conditions rather than psychological trauma. The diversity of the cases presented new challenges for Mathelda's approach. She found that her silent music needed to be adapted for different types of communication barriers, and that children with autism, in particular, seemed to respond to different frequencies and rhythms than those dealing with trauma-based mutism. Working with Rebecca and the Foundation's expanding team of support staff, Mathelda began to develop a more sophisticated understanding of the various ways that children could become disconnected from their voices. Some had lost the ability to speak due to shock and fear, others had never fully developed conventional communication skills, and still others were choosing silence as a form of protection from a world that felt unsafe or incomprehensible. Each type of silence required a different approach, a different form of musical dialogue. Children with autism often responded to very structured, repetitive melodies that provided a sense of predictability and safety. Those dealing with abuse required music that was gentle and non-threatening, carefully avoiding any sounds or rhythms that might trigger traumatic memories. Children with neurological conditions needed performances that worked with their specific cognitive strengths and limitations. The complexity of this work was both exhausting and exhilarating for Mathilda. She was constantly learning, constantly adapting her approach to meet the unique needs of each child. But she was also discovering that her abilities continued to evolve and deepen with experience. The silent music she could create now was far more sophisticated and nuanced than what she had been capable of just a few months earlier. As the Foundation's work continued to expand and evolve, Mathilda began to realize that her journey from the frozen campfire to this moment had been preparing her for something much larger than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just helping individual children find their voices, she was pioneering an entirely new understanding of how communication and healing could work when they moved beyond the limitations of conventional sound and speech. The little girl, named Lucy, whose death had seemed like such a senseless tragedy, had somehow orchestrated events that were touching the lives of countless children across the country. Her legacy was growing with each child who learned to sing in silence, each professional who developed new ways of listening, each family that discovered hope where they had only known despair. The phone call that would change everything came on a snowy February morning from Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, director of the International Institute for Childhood Trauma Research in Geneva, Switzerland. Margaret Henley answered the phone in her office, at the Foundation, expecting another routine inquiry about their programs. Instead, she found herself speaking with one of the world's leading experts on childhood psychology. Mrs. Henley, Dr. Tanaka began in carefully measured English, I am calling because we have been following the remarkable work being done at your foundation. We have a situation here that we believe may require Miss Williams's unique expertise, but it involves circumstances that are quite unprecedented. The case Dr. Tanaka described was unlike anything the Foundation had encountered before. A group of 43 children, refugees from a war-torn region of Eastern Europe, had been rescued from a bombed-out orphanage and brought to Switzerland for medical treatment and rehabilitation. All of the children had been traumatized by months of warfare, but 12 of them presented an especially puzzling condition. These children appear to have developed a form of collective mutism, Dr. Tanaka explained. They communicate with each other through gestures and expressions, but they make no vocalizations whatsoever. What makes this case particularly unusual is that they seem to share some form of non-verbal communication system that our translators cannot decode. They respond to each other's silent signals in ways that suggest they are having complex conversations, but we cannot understand what. They are communicating. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as she listened to the description. It sounded remarkably similar to what she had observed when Mathilda worked with groups of children at the Foundation, creating silent musical dialogues that seemed to exist on a level beyond conventional communication. Dr. Tanaka, she said, carefully, what you're describing sounds like it might be related to the work we do here, but I need to understand more about what you're asking. Are you requesting that Miss Williams travel to Switzerland to work with these children? That is exactly what we are requesting, Dr. Tanaka confirmed. We have consulted with experts around the world, and Miss Williams' approach appears to be the only intervention that might be able to reach these children. We understand this is an enormous request, and we are prepared to provide whatever support and resources are necessary. When Margaret shared the conversation with Mathilda and Rebecca, their initial reaction was one of overwhelming anxiety. The idea of traveling to a foreign country to work with children who had experienced the horrors of war felt far beyond the scope of what they had prepared for. The Foundation's work had been challenging enough when dealing with individual cases of trauma, but this situation involved an entirely different magnitude of suffering. We don't know anything about working with war refugees, Rebecca pointed out during their emergency staff meeting. The cultural barriers alone could make it Impossible for us to connect with these children, and we have no idea what specific traumas they've experienced. Mathelda sat quietly during the initial discussion, her expression thoughtful and troubled. When the others had finished expressing their concerns, she began one of her silent performances, not directed at anyone in particular, but seemingly exploring her own emotional response to the request. Rebecca listened carefully to the music she was hearing, trying to interpret what Mathelda was working through. The melody was complex and conflicted, with themes of fear and inadequacy interweaving with deeper currents of compassion and purpose. There was something else in the music too, a recognition that seemed to suggest Mathelda was hearing echoes of her own experience in the description of these traumatized children. "You see yourself in them," Rebecca said softly. "Children who have lost their voices to trauma, who have found ways to communicate that the adult world can't understand." Mathelda nodded, then continued her silent performance. This time, the music carried a clearer message, determination mixed with humility, a willingness to try even if success was uncertain. The decision to accept Dr. Tanaka's invitation was not made lightly. The Foundation's board spent hours discussing the potential risks and benefits, consulting with international trauma experts and cultural specialists. Thomas and Margaret Henley were particularly concerned about exposing Mathelda to the intense scrutiny that would inevitably accompany such a high-profile international case, but ultimately it was Mathelda herself who made the final decision. Through Rebecca's interpretation, she communicated that she felt a deep responsibility to at least attempt to help children who might be experiencing the same kind of isolation and misunderstanding that she had endured. "These children have found each other in their silence," she explained, through her combination of gestures and musical expression. "But they're trapped there, cut off from the adults who are trying to help them. If there's any chance that my experience can serve as a bridge between their world and ours, then I have to try." The preparation for the trip to Geneva required weeks of intensive planning. Rebecca would accompany Mathelda as her interpreter and emotional support, while Dr. Vasquez from the Mountain Hope Foundation would serve as a consulting psychologist. They worked with cultural specialists to understand the background and traditions of the Eastern European region where the children had originated, and they studied everything available about the specific traumas associated with warfare and refugee experiences. The most challenging aspect of the preparation was emotional rather than logistical. Mathelda had not traveled far from the Colorado mountains since her recovery, and the thought of leaving the safe environment of the Foundation triggered anxiety that manifested in her silent music for days before their departure. Rebecca could hear the fear in her performances, but also a growing sense of resolve as Mathelda prepared herself for what might be the most important work of her life. The flight to Geneva was Mathelda's first time on an airplane since before her trauma, and the experience proved to be more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The confined space, the engine noise, and the separation from the natural environment that had become essential to her healing process all combined to create a state of severe distress that Rebecca had never witnessed before. "She's having a kind of panic response," Rebecca told Dr. Vasquez as Mathelda sat rigid in her seat, her face pale and her breathing rapid and shallow. "It's like she's reliving some aspect of her original trauma." Dr. Vasquez recognized the signs of what psychologists call trauma echoing, a phenomenon where individuals who have experienced severe psychological injury can be triggered by circumstances that are only tangentially related to their original traumatic experience. The airplane's enclosed environment and mechanical sounds were apparently reminding Mathelda's nervous system of feelings of helplessness and disconnection from safety. Working together, Rebecca and Dr. Vasquez created an improvised therapeutic intervention at 30,000 feet. Rebecca began to vocalize very softly, creating actual sounds that seemed to harmonize with whatever silent music Mathilda was producing in her distressed state. Other passengers initially looked annoyed by the quiet humming, but something about the sounds Rebecca was making seemed to have a calming effect on everyone in the immediate area. Gradually, Mathilda's breathing began to slow, and her rigid posture relaxed. The panic response subsided, replaced by a form of meditation that allowed her to find inner stillness despite the artificial environment of the aircraft. By the time they landed in Geneva, she had regained her equilibrium, though the experience had reminded everyone involved of how fragile her recovery remained. The International Institute for Childhood Trauma Research was housed in a modern facility on the outskirts of Geneva, with views of Lake Geneva and the surrounding Alps that provided some comfort to Mathilda after the disorienting airplane journey. Dr. Tanaka met them personally at the entrance, a small, precise man whose formal demeanor barely concealed his deep compassion for the children in his care. "The situation has become more complex since we first spoke," he informed them as he led them through the facility's corridors. "The 12 children with the collective mutism have begun to influence some of the other refugee children. We now have 18 children who appear to be communicating through this silent system, and our regular staff members are becoming increasingly frustrated by their inability to understand what is happening." The living quarters for the refugee children had been designed to feel as much like a family environment as possible, with small groups housed in apartment-style units under the supervision of trained caregivers. But when Dr. Tanaka led them to the common area where the affected children spent their days, the atmosphere was anything but familial. The 12 original children sat together in a tight cluster, their ages ranging from about 6 to 14 years old. Their body language and facial expressions clearly indicated that they were engaged in intense communication, but they made absolutely no sound. Occasionally, one child would make a subtle gesture or shift their posture, and the entire group would respond with what appeared to be understanding or agreement. 6 additional children hovered around the edges of this central group, clearly trying to understand and participate in whatever communication system was being used. These children would sometimes attempt to mimic the gestures they observed, but their efforts seemed clumsy and unsuccessful compared to the fluid interactions of the original group. "It's like they've developed their own language," Rebecca whispered. "To Mathilda, a complete communication system that exists entirely outside of speech," Dr. Tanaka nodded grimly. "That is exactly what our linguists believe has happened. These children experienced trauma so severe that they retreated into a shared form of non-verbal communication. But because we cannot understand this system, we cannot assess their psychological state or provide appropriate treatment." What happened next surprised everyone in the room. As soon as Mathilda entered the space where the children were gathered, the entire group fell silent, not just vocally, but in terms of their gestures and movements as well. They turned toward her with expressions of intense curiosity and something that looked almost like recognition. Mathilda stood very still for a long moment, apparently listening to something that only she could hear. Then she began one of her silent performances. But this music was different from anything Rebecca had experienced before. It was more complex, more layered, as if Mathilda were trying to communicate on multiple levels simultaneously. The children's response was immediate and profound. They began to move in subtle ways that seemed to harmonize with whatever they were perceiving from Mathilda's performance. It wasn't exactly dancing, but it was clearly a form of physical response to musical input that existed beyond the range of normal hearing. More remarkably, after several minutes of this silent interaction, one of the older children, A girl who appeared to be about 13, stood up and began to move through the space in a way that seemed to be creating her own form of silent music. Rebecca could actually hear something in the girl's movements, a melody that was distinct from Mathelda's, but seemed to be responding to it. "They're having a conversation," Rebecca said in amazement. "Mathelda is asking them questions with her music, and they're answering through their movements." Dr. Tanaka and his staff watched in fascination as this unprecedented form of communication unfolded. Over the course of an hour, Mathelda seemed to establish some form of rapport with the entire group of affected children. They began to include her in their gestural communication system, responding to her silent music with increasingly complex movements and expressions. The breakthrough came when the youngest child in the group, a boy who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, walked directly up to Mathelda and placed his small hand on her heart. The gesture was clearly meaningful within their communication system because the other children immediately gathered around them in a tight circle. What followed was one of the most moving scenes Rebecca had ever witnessed. The children began to tell their story through a combination of movements, expressions, and silent music that Mathelda somehow facilitated and translated. Rebecca could hear fragments of the narrative in the melodies that seemed to emerge from the group interaction. Images of bombs falling, buildings collapsing, families being separated, and children clinging to each other as their world dissolved into chaos. But there was more to their story than just trauma. Rebecca could also hear themes of remarkable resilience and courage, as these children had somehow found each other in the wreckage of their former lives and created a new form of family bound together by their shared silence. They had developed their communication system not just as a response to trauma, but as a way of protecting and caring for each other when no adults were available to provide safety and comfort. They're not just traumatized, Rebecca realized. They're protective. They've created this silent communication system because they don't trust adults to understand or protect them. They only trust each other. The implications of this insight were staggering. These children hadn't simply lost their voices to trauma, they had consciously chosen silence as a way of maintaining control over their emotional safety. Their communication system was a form of resistance, a way of preserving their autonomy and dignity in a world that had shown them nothing but violence and abandonment. Understanding this changed everything about how Dr. Tanaka and his staff would need to approach their treatment. Rather than trying to force the children back into conventional communication patterns, they would need to respect and work with the system the children had created, gradually building trust that would allow the children to choose to expand their communication beyond their protective circle. As their first day of work came to an end, Mathelda performed one final silent piece for the children, a musical message that seemed to acknowledge their strength and intelligence while gently suggesting that there might be ways to bridge between their world and the larger community that wanted to help them. The children's response was a collective gesture that Dr. Tanaka's interpreters later identified as a formal invitation. In their original culture, it was a way of welcoming someone into the family, of indicating that they were now considered trustworthy enough to be included in the most intimate communications. Mathelda had accomplished in one day what months of conventional therapy had failed to achieve. She had been accepted into the children's circle of trust, creating the foundation for a healing process that would honor their resilience while helping them find ways to reconnect with the broader world that they had been forced to leave behind. Aga's second week of work in Geneva brought an unexpected challenge that would test every skill Mathelda had developed since her own healing began. Dr. Tanaka approached her with troubling news about one of the refugee children who had not been part of the original silent communication group. Her name is Anya Petrov, Dr. Tanaka explained, as he led Matilda and Rebecca through a different wing of the facility. She's 15 years old, and her situation is quite different from the others. She was separated from her family during the evacuation and has been completely catatonic since arriving here 3 weeks ago. She doesn't respond to any form of communication, silent or otherwise. She simply sits and stares, as if her mind has retreated to some place where we cannot reach her. The room where Anya was housed felt different from the communal spaces where the other children lived. It was quieter, more sterile, with the oppressive atmosphere of a place where hope had been systematically drained away. Anya sat in a chair by the window, her dark hair hanging like a curtain around her face, her eyes fixed on some distant point that seemed to exist beyond the physical world. Rebecca had seen catatonic states before during her training, but there was something about Anya's stillness that felt more profound than simple psychological withdrawal. The girl seemed to have disconnected not just from communication, but from existence itself, as if she had made a conscious decision to stop participating in a reality that had become unbearable. "How long has she been like this?" Rebecca asked Dr. Tanaka in a whisper, though it seemed unlikely that Anya was aware of their presence. According to the reports from the rescue team, she was found in the basement of a destroyed school, where she had apparently been hiding for several days after becoming separated from the other children during a bombing raid. She was physically unharmed, but already showing signs of complete psychological shutdown. Since then, she has eaten only when fed, and she requires assistance with all basic functions. Matilda approached Anya's chair slowly, her movements careful and non-threatening. As she drew closer, Rebecca could hear the subtle beginnings of a silent song, but this music was different from anything she had experienced before. It was tentative, almost whispered, as if Matilda were trying to reach across an enormous distance to make contact with someone who might not want to be found. There was no visible response from Anya. Her breathing remained shallow and regular, her posture unchanged, her gaze still fixed on that invisible point beyond the window. But Rebecca detected something in Matilda's music that suggested she was hearing some form of response, even if it wasn't apparent to outside observers. For nearly an hour, Matilda continued her gentle musical outreach, creating melodies that seemed designed to offer comfort without demanding any form of engagement in return. Dr. Tanaka and his staff watched with growing concern, wondering if this might be the first case that Matilda's unique abilities couldn't reach. Then something remarkable happened. Anya's breathing changed, becoming slightly deeper and more rhythmic. It was such a subtle shift that Dr. Tanaka almost missed it, but Rebecca could hear how Matilda's music immediately responded to this tiny sign of life, becoming slightly more present and encouraging. "She's listening," Rebecca whispered. "She may not be responding visibly, but some part of her is hearing the music." Over the next several days, Matilda established a routine of spending 2 hours each morning with Anya, creating patient, gentle musical conversations that asked for nothing, but offered unlimited compassion and understanding. The progress was almost imperceptible. Tiny changes in breathing patterns, slight shifts in posture, moments when Anya's eyes seemed to focus more clearly on her immediate surroundings. The breakthrough came during their 6th session together, when Matilda was creating a particularly soft and nurturing piece that seemed to speak of safety and protection. Suddenly, Anya turned her head and looked directly at Matilda for the first time since their work had begun. The eye contact lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to confirm that Anya was still present somewhere inside her withdrawn state. More importantly, Rebecca could hear in Matilda's music that this brief connection had revealed something significant about the nature of Anya's condition. "She's not catatonic," Rebecca realized. "She's hiding. She's made herself invisible because being seen feels too dangerous. This insight changed everything about their approach. Instead of trying to draw Anya back into the world, Mathelda began to create music that honored her need for invisibility, while gently suggesting that there might be safe ways to begin emerging from her hiding place. The process was painstakingly slow, requiring enormous patience and sensitivity. Each day brought tiny increments of progress, a slight turn of the head, a moment of direct eye contact, a barely perceptible relaxation in her rigid posture. Dr. Tanaka documented these changes with fascination, recognizing that he was witnessing a form of therapeutic intervention that had never been formally described in the psychological literature. Meanwhile, Mathelda's work with the group of children who had developed the collective communication system was yielding equally remarkable results. As their trust in her grew, they began to include her more fully in their silent conversations, sharing details about their experiences that helped Dr. Tanaka's team understand the specific traumas they had endured. Through Mathelda's interpretation, the staff learned that the children had witnessed not just the physical destruction of their community, but the complete breakdown of the social structures that had previously provided meaning and safety in their lives. They had seen adults become helpless, had watched trusted authority figures abandon their responsibilities, and had experienced the terror of realizing that the grown-up world they had depended on was far more fragile than they had ever imagined. Their silent communication system was revealed to be an incredibly sophisticated method of sharing survival information, emotional support, and collective decision-making. The children had essentially created their own micro-society with its own rules, hierarchies, and cultural practices, all conducted through gestures, expressions, and the kind of silent music that only Mathelda seemed able to fully understand. "They've become a tribe," Rebecca observed during one of their evening debriefing sessions with Dr. Tanaka. "They've developed their own language, their own customs, their own ways of caring for each other. What we're seeing isn't pathology, it's adaptation. They've created a functional society that meets their emotional and social needs." This realization led to a fundamental shift in the treatment approach. Instead of trying to reintegrate the children into conventional communication patterns, Dr. Tanaka's team began to respect and work with the system they had created. Mathelda served as a cultural interpreter, helping the adults understand the children's needs and concerns while gradually building bridges between their silent world and the larger community. The most remarkable development came when Anya began to show interest in the group activities. After 2 weeks of individual sessions with Mathelda, she started to turn her head toward the sounds of the other children's interactions. Her catatonic state was gradually giving way to a form of watchful observation that suggested she was evaluating whether it might be safe to begin engaging with her peers. The moment when Anya first joined the group was one that none of the observers would ever forget. She approached the circle of children slowly, her movements still hesitant and defensive. The other children seemed to sense her fragility and made space for her without any obvious communication, adjusting their positions to include her while maintaining the gentle, non-threatening atmosphere that characterized their interactions. Mathelda created a special performance for this occasion, music that seemed designed to introduce Anya to the group while acknowledging her unique vulnerability. Rebecca could hear themes of welcome and protection in the melody, as well as deeper currents that spoke of understanding the particular kind of hiding that Anya had been doing. To everyone's amazement, Anya began to participate in the group's silent communication almost immediately. It was as if she had been observing and learning their system during her weeks of apparent withdrawal, preparing herself to join them when she felt emotionally ready. Dr. Tanaka later theorized that Anya's catatonic state had actually been a form of intensive observation, a way of studying her environment and assessing safety before committing to any form of engagement. Her apparent withdrawal had been a sophisticated survival strategy rather than a pathological condition. As the weeks progressed, both Anya and the larger group began to show signs of being ready to expand their communication beyond their protective circle. They started to show interest in learning conventional language skills, though they insisted on maintaining their silent system as their primary form of intimate communication. Mathilda worked with Dr. Tanaka's staff to develop a bilingual approach that honored both forms of communication. The children would learn to interact with the adult world through conventional speech and gestures, but they would retain their silent language as a private form of expression that belonged exclusively to them. The success of this approach led to broader changes in how the facility handled other refugee children who were struggling with communication issues. Staff members began to receive training in recognizing and respecting alternative forms of expression, and the entire therapeutic philosophy shifted toward working with children's adaptive strategies rather than trying to eliminate them. But perhaps the most significant development was the effect that the work in Geneva was having on Mathilda herself. Being accepted into the children's circle of trust had awakened something in her that had been dormant since her own trauma. For the first time since losing her voice, she began to feel that her unique abilities had a larger purpose, that her journey through silence had prepared her for work that no one else could do. Rebecca noticed changes in Mathilda's silent music that reflected this growing sense of purpose. The melodies were becoming more complex and confident, incorporating themes of leadership and responsibility that had been absent during her earlier healing process. Mathilda was evolving from someone who had been broken by trauma into someone who could help others transform their own wounds into sources of strength. The transformation was perhaps most evident in her work with Anya, who had become not just a client, but a kind of apprentice. The teenager was developing her own sensitivity to the silent forms of communication that Mathilda used, and she began to serve as a bridge between Mathilda and some of the newer children who arrived at the facility. Dr. Tanaka documented this development with particular interest, recognizing that he was witnessing the emergence of a new form of peer counseling. Anya's experience of extreme withdrawal and gradual emergence made her uniquely qualified to help other children who were struggling with similar issues. As their time in Geneva drew to a close, Mathilda faced a difficult decision. Dr. Tanaka had offered her a permanent position at the International Institute, with the opportunity to develop a new department focused on alternative communication therapies. The work would be challenging and prestigious, with the potential to influence trauma treatment practices around the world. But Mathilda felt a deep pull to return to the Lucy Rose Foundation, where her journey had begun and where she felt her roots were deepest. The decision was complicated by her growing attachment to the children in Geneva, particularly Anya, who had made remarkable progress but still needed ongoing support. The solution came from an unexpected source. Anya herself, speaking for the first time since her arrival at the facility, asked if she could come to Colorado to continue her healing process and to learn more about the work that Mathilda was doing at the foundation. "I want to help other children who have lost their voices," Anya said in careful accented English. "Miss Williams has shown me that silence can be a gift if we learn to use it to help others. I want to learn to do what she does." The request opened up possibilities that no one had considered before. What if the Lucy Rose Foundation could become an international center for training young people who had experienced trauma to become peer counselors for others dealing with similar issues? What if Mathilda's unique abilities could be used to identify and develop other individuals who had the potential to work with alternative forms of communication? As they prepared to leave Geneva, Mathilda performed one final concert for all the children at the facility. This time, it wasn't just a therapeutic intervention. It was a celebration of resilience, a musical acknowledgement of the extraordinary strength that children could develop when they were given the support and respect they needed to heal in their own ways. The performance was different from anything Rebecca had heard before, incorporating elements that seemed to come from the children themselves, rhythms and melodies that had emerged from their collective communication system, harmonies that reflected their shared experiences of loss and recovery. For the first time, since her own trauma, Mathelda was creating music that truly belonged to a community rather than emerging solely from her individual experience. It was a sign that her healing had reached a new level, one that allowed her to channel not just her own pain and recovery, but the collective wisdom of all the children she had worked with. As the last notes of the silent symphony faded into the Swiss mountain air, Rebecca realized that they were returning to Colorado with more than just the satisfaction of successful work. They were bringing back a vision of what healing could look like when it honored the full spectrum of human communication and resilience. 5 years after Jake Morrison first found her by that dying campfire, Mathelda Williams stood before an audience of 300 professionals at the International Conference on Childhood Trauma in Boston. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. A woman who had lost her voice was about to deliver the keynote address about revolutionary approaches to healing. Rebecca Chen sat in the front row, ready to serve as interpreter, but something had changed in recent months. Mathelda's silent music had evolved to a point where many people in the audience could sense its meaning without translation. Her gestures had become more expressive, her presence more commanding, and somehow her message seemed to reach people directly, bypassing the need for conventional speech. Anya Petrov, now 20, and serving as the Lucy Rose Foundation's first international outreach coordinator, operated the presentation slides from the side of the stage. The young woman who had once been catatonic now helped other trauma survivors around the world, having developed her own unique blend of Mathelda's techniques and traditional therapeutic approaches. The presentation began with a simple gesture. Mathelda placed her hand over her heart and looked out at the audience with an expression of profound gratitude. Without saying a word, she had communicated volumes about the journey that had brought her to this moment. What followed was unlike any academic presentation the conference attendees had ever witnessed. Mathelda created a silent symphony that told the story of every child she had worked with. The Rodriguez siblings, who had learned to create music together, Marcus Washington, who had discovered his voice through understanding his pain, David, Kim, who had emerged from selective mutism, the refugee children who had taught her about the power of collective healing, and countless others whose names would never be known, but whose lives had been forever changed. The audience sat in rapt attention, many of them experiencing something they couldn't quite name. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had traveled from the Mountain Hope Foundation to attend the presentation, found herself crying as she listened to music that seemed to emerge from the very air around them. Jake Morrison, now serving on the Lucy Rose Foundation's board of directors, watched with amazement as the woman he had once found dying in the wilderness commanded the attention of some of the world's leading experts in child psychology. B-set. Presentation's climax came when Mathelda began to incorporate the audience into her performance. Without any verbal instruction, she somehow guided 300 professionals to participate in a collective experience of silent music. People began to sway gently, their breathing synchronized, their hearts beating in rhythm with something that transcended individual consciousness. In that moment, every person in the auditorium understood what Mathelda had discovered during her journey through trauma and healing. Communication was far more vast and mysterious than anyone had previously imagined. The human capacity for connection extended far beyond words, beyond conventional sound, beyond all the barriers that typically separated one soul from another. When the presentation ended, the silence that followed was not empty but full, pregnant with possibility and understanding. Then, slowly, one person began to clap. Others joined in, and soon the entire auditorium was filled with thunderous applause that seemed to go on forever. But the most remarkable moment came next. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the physician who had first referred David Kim to the foundation, stood up and asked a question that had been on everyone's mind. "Miss Williams, your work has helped thousands of children find their voices. Have you found yours?" Mathilda looked at her questionnaire for a long moment, then at Rebecca, then at Anya. She walked to the center of the stage and placed both hands over her heart. When she opened her mouth, no one expected what came next. "Yes," she said, her physical voice emerging for the first time in 6 years. It was soft, slightly rusty from disuse, but unmistakably real. "I found it in the silence." The auditorium erupted in gasps and tears. Rebecca felt her own voice catch in her throat as she realized that Mathilda's healing had reached a completion that none of them had dared to hope for. "My voice was never really lost," Mathilda continued, her words gaining strength with each syllable. "It was transformed. I had to learn to speak in a language that could reach the deepest places of pain and hope in the human heart. And in learning that language, I discovered that every one of us has the capacity to heal not just ourselves, but each other." She paused, looking out at the audience with eyes that held both sorrow and joy. "The children I have worked with taught me that trauma doesn't just break us, it can also break us open. It can shatter the limited ways we thought we had to communicate and connect and reveal capacities we never knew we possessed." The speech that followed was brief but profound. Mathilda spoke about the Lucy Rose Foundation's expansion into an international network of healing centers, each one adapting her approaches to different cultures and communities. She described the training programs that were now operating on 4 continents, teaching professionals to recognize and work with alternative forms of communication. Most importantly, she spoke about the children themselves, not as victims to be pitied, but as teachers who had profound wisdom to offer about resilience, adaptation, and the countless ways that love could be expressed when traditional forms of connection had been damaged or destroyed. "We named our foundation after a little girl who died in a fire," Mathilda said, her voice now strong and clear. "But Lucy Rose is not really gone. She lives in every child who discovers that their voice, whatever form it takes, has the power to heal not just themselves, but others. She lives in every moment when silence becomes a bridge instead of a wall. She lives in the understanding that brokenness can be the beginning of something more beautiful than anything we could have imagined when we were whole." As the conference concluded and people began to disperse, many approached Mathilda to share their own stories of loss and recovery. A speech therapist from Japan spoke about clients who had found healing through forms of expression that existed beyond traditional language. A social worker from Nigeria described children in her community who had developed their own communication systems in response to trauma and displacement. The ripple effects of Mathilda's work were spreading far beyond what anyone could have predicted. Professional training programs were being established around the world. Research projects were being launched to study the neurological and psychological mechanisms behind alternative forms of communication. Most importantly, children who had been written off as unreachable were being approached with new respect and understanding. That evening, as Mathilda, Rebecca and Anya sat in a quiet restaurant overlooking Boston Harbor, they reflected on how far they had all traveled from that frozen campfire in the Colorado wilderness. "I've been thinking about that night when Jake found you," Rebecca said. "You were waiting to die, But you were also performing. Even in your darkest moment, you were creating music. Mathelda nodded, her eyes distant with memory. I was saying goodbye, she said softly, but I was also asking for help, even though I didn't realize it at the time. The music was calling for someone who could hear it. And Jake heard it, Anya added. Even though he couldn't understand what it meant, something about your silent song made him stop and pay attention. That's the thing about this work, Mathelda reflected. We're all already connected in ways we don't fully understand. Trauma can make us forget that connection, but it can't actually destroy it. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us how to listen with our whole beings instead of just our ears. As they prepared to return to Colorado the next morning, Mathelda received a message that would shape the next phase of her journey. The United Nations had requested her consultation on a project involving child refugees from multiple conflicts around the world. They wanted to establish healing centers that could serve children who spoke dozens of different languages and came from vastly different cultural backgrounds. They're asking us to help create a universal language of healing, Rebecca said as she read the proposal, something that can reach any child, regardless of their background or the specific nature of their trauma. Mathelda smiled, and for a moment her friends could see in her expression the same joy that had once filled her face when she led children's choirs in Denver. But this joy was deeper, more complex, seasoned by suffering and transformed by purpose. We already have that language, she said. We've had it all along. We just needed to remember how to use it. The plane ride back to Colorado was peaceful, without the anxiety that had marked their journey to Geneva years earlier. As they flew over the Rocky Mountains, Mathelda looked down at the vast wilderness where her healing had begun, and created one final, silent song, a melody of gratitude that seemed to encompass every frozen campfire, every dying ember, every moment of despair that had somehow transformed into an opportunity for connection and hope. The woman who had once lost everything to silence had found a voice that could speak to the deepest places of the human heart. And in finding her own voice, she had helped countless others discover that theirs had never really been lost, only waiting for someone who knew how to listen in the language of healing that exists beyond words, beyond sound, beyond all the barriers that separate one wounded soul from another. In the end, that was the miracle that began with a dying campfire and a woman who learned to sing in silence. The discovery that our capacity to heal each other is as vast and mysterious as our capacity to wound, and that sometimes the most profound transformations come not from finding our way back to who we used to be, but from discovering who we were always meant to become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.